Florence Pius had exactly 5 seconds to make a decision that would likely get her killed. 5 seconds to abandon the invisible protocol of the gilded cage. 5 seconds to cross the 10 feet of polished mahogany floor separating the service station from the VIP booth. She had to breach the perimeter of the most dangerous man in New York and pray he wouldn't signal his guards to stop her. The man with the tailored navy suit and the stillness of a statue didn't flinch as she approached. His dark eyes, previously fixed on nothing, locked onto her face. There was no surprise there, only a cold, terrifying calculation. He was younger than the rumors suggested, but the air around him felt heavier, pressurized. "More water, sir?" Florence asked, her voice steady despite the riot happening in her chest. She leaned sharply forward over the table, gripping her serving tray with white-knuckled force to mask her trembling. She was close enough to smell the crisp, expensive scent of his cologne mixed with the faint metallic tang of the restaurant's AC. "3 men," she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat as she poured the water, her eyes wide and pleading. 9 o'clock. Guns. His gaze didn't dart to the door, it moved only to her eyes, then to the reflection in the window behind her. Understanding dawned in that unreadable face. "Is that so?" His voice was a low hum, vibrant and dangerous. Then, instead of reaching for his weapon, his hand shot out and clamped over her wrist, not to hurt her, but to anchor her. "Stay down." 2 hours earlier, Florence had been praying for a boring shift. She stood near the kitchen pass, smoothing the front of her black waitress dress. The white collar was starched stiff and her apron was spotless, a shield of professionalism she wore like armor. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, neat bun that kept her face open and trustworthy. It was the look she had perfected over 3 years at the restaurant, invisible, efficient, and observant. "Table 4 needs a refresh on the Merlot, and stop daydreaming," the floor manager snapped as he breezed past, checking his watch. "Already on it," Florence murmured, grabbing a fresh bottle. She moved through the dining room of the Gilded Cage with practiced grace. The restaurant was a theater of warm amber lighting, leather booths, and old money. It was designed to make the chaotic city outside feel miles away. The clinking of silverware and the soft hum of jazz were the only sounds allowed here. Florence poured the wine for a couple celebrating an anniversary, but her eyes, as always, were scanning the room. It was a habit from a life spent protecting her siblings, watching the exits, reading the room tone. She watched the heavy oak doors near the entrance swing open. 2 men in ill-fitting suits stumbled in, not waiting for the hostess. They weren't looking for a table. They were looking for a target. The command had barely left his lips when the world exploded. The 2 men Florence had spotted at the entrance stopped grappling with the hostess and drew weapons. The woman in the booth to Florence's left screamed, a high, piercing sound that was immediately cut off by the deafening crack of gunfire. A crystal vase on a nearby table disintegrated, spraying water and glass across the terrified onlookers. Taewon didn't flinch. With a fluid, violent motion, he kicked the heavy oak table from underneath. It upended with a groan of timber, crashing onto its side to form a barricade. In the same breath, he grabbed the back of Florence's apron and yanked her down into the darkness behind the wood. China plates shattered against the front of their makeshift shield, and the air turned instantly hot, smelling of sulfur and ozone. Florence pressed her hands over her ears, curling into a ball on the floor she had just swept. Above her, Taewon was a portrait of lethal calm. He wasn't cowering, he was waiting. He rose slightly, firing 2 shots over the rim of the table. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Thud. Thud. The chaos in the room turned into a stunned, smoking silence. Taewon crouched back down, holstering his weapon inside his jacket as if he were merely putting away a wallet. He turned to Florence. His eyes were hard, scanning her face for injuries, but then his gaze snapped to the entrance where a 3rd man was retreating into the night. Florence tried to scramble back, her breath coming in jagged gasps, her hands slipping on the wine-slipped floor. I have to go." You can't, Taewon said, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. He grabbed her wrist again, tighter this time. They saw you warn me. That man who ran, he knows your face now. He didn't wait for her permission. He hauled her to her feet, shielding her body with his own as they navigated them through the swinging kitchen doors, bypassing the screaming chefs and cowering staff. They burst out into the humid night air of the alleyway, where a sleek black sedan idled, engine purring. Florence dug her heels into the asphalt. I am not getting in that car. My shift. Your shift is over, Taewon said, opening the passenger door and shoving her inside with a force that brooked no argument. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his dark eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. You chose a side the moment you spoke to me, Florence. Now you have to survive it. He slammed the door shut, locking her in, and the car screeched away before she could even reach for the handle. The city lights smeared into aggressive streaks of neon as the sedan tore down the FDR drive, weaving through traffic with terrifying fluidity. Inside, the silence was heavier than the humid air they had left behind in the alley. Florence sat rigid in the passenger seat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the man beside her, the man who had just shot 2 people without blinking. "Stop the car," she said. It wasn't a request. Taewon didn't look at her. His hands were loosed on the wheel, guiding the vehicle with infuriating calm. "I can't do that, Miss Pius." "You know my name?" The violation of privacy stung almost as much as the kidnapping. "Take me home, right now. I won't tell the police anything." "The police are the least of your worries," Taewon said, his voice low and devoid of pity. "The men in the restaurant were from the Gunka clan. They don't leave loose ends. And tonight, you didn't just witness a hit, you interfered with one." He glanced at the rearview mirror. "In their eyes, that makes you a collaborator." "I poured you water," Florence snapped, turning in her seat to face him. "I did my job." "You tipped me off," he corrected. "You saved my life. And the moment you leaned over that table, you signed a death warrant for the woman who pours water." "I want to go to my apartment," she insisted, though her tremor in her voice betrayed her. "My sister." "If you go home, you die. If you call your sister, she dies." Taewon finally turned his head, catching her gaze at a red light. He looked down at her hands. They were resting on her knees, shaking so violently that the fabric of her dress vibrated. Fear was radiating off her in waves. But then he looked up at her face. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry, burning with indignation rather than tears. Most people would be hysterical by now, begging or weeping. Florence was negotiating. A flicker of something like respect passed through his dark eyes. She was terrified, yes, but underneath the panic, there was steel. "I am taking you to the only place in this city where the Goompa cannot reach you," he said, shifting gears as the car plunged into the darkness of a private underground garage. The heavy steel gate rattled shut behind them, sealing the exit. "You're a prisoner of circumstance, Florence," Taewon said, killing the engine and plunging them into silence. "But at least you're a living one." The penthouse was less a home and more a fortress of glass and steel, suspended 50 stories above the city. It was cold, silent, and terrifyingly expansive. Florence paced the length of the living room, her waitress shoes squeaking softly on the polished marble, while a man leaned against the doorframe, watching her with open hostility. "Sit down," he said. This was Junho, Taewon's second in command. He had the eyes of a shark and a scar running through his left eyebrow. "You're making me dizzy." "I'm not a dog," Florence snapped, stopping to glare at him, "and I'm not a guest. I want a phone." "No outgoing calls. Boss's orders." Junho pushed off the wall, walking toward her. He looked her up and down, sneering at her rumpled uniform. "If it were up to me, you'd be tied to a chair in the basement. Only a mole survives a hit that clean." Florence ignored him, her eyes darting to a sleek landline sitting on a side table near the kitchen. She waited until Junho turned to check his watch, then she lunged. She snatched the receiver, her fingers trembling as she jammed in her sister's number. 1 ring. 2 rings. A hand clamped over hers, forcing the receiver back into the cradle with a violent clatter. Florence spun around, ready to fight, but found herself chest to chest with Taiwan. He had changed out of his suit into a dark cashmere sweater, but the gun holster was still visible at his side. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "I told you," he said quietly. "No contact." "My sister is at home," Florence hissed, trying to shove past him. "If they know who I am, they know where I live. I have to warn her." "It's too late for warnings." Taiwan didn't move. He reached for a remote on the table and flicked the wall-mounted television on. The screen filled with the chaotic flashing lights of fire trucks and police cruisers. The headline banner screamed in red, "2-alarm fire gut Queen's apartment complex." Florence felt the blood drain from her face. The camera zoomed in on a window, her window, spewing black smoke. The fire escape where she used to smoke on bad nights was twisted metal. "No," she whispered, her knees buckling. "Sarah!" "Your sister wasn't there," Taiwan said, his voice dropping an octave. "My men intersected her coming home from her shift. She's in a safe house in Jersey. But your apartment, your life, it's gone, Florence." He stepped closer, forcing her to look away from the burning screen and into his eyes. The Goon Pod didn't wait to ask questions. They burned it down just to flush you out. You have no home to go back to. You stay here or you die. Do you understand now? Florence looked at the fire, then at the cold luxury of her cage. She nodded slowly, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a chilling clarity. The tension in the penthouse was a physical weight, heavier than the humidity pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For 3 hours, Taewon and Junho had been dissecting the security footage from the gilded cage, frame by grainy frame, hunting for the leak. "It's a ghost," Junho slammed his hand on the marble island, making the monitors jump. "The camera angle on the entrance is blocked by the hostess stand. We can't see who signaled the shooters." Florence stood by the refrigerator, holding a glass of water she hadn't drunk. She watched them replay the same 10 seconds of footage. The restaurant entrance, the blur of the hitman, and the arm of a man holding the door open for them. "It wasn't a signal from inside," Florence said softly. The room went silent. Taewon turned on his swivel chair, his expression caught between exhaustion and irritation. "Excuse me?" "You're looking for someone waving a napkin or checking a phone," Florence said, walking toward the monitors. She pointed at the screen, at the arm holding the door. But the signal happened at the door. Look at the man holding it. He didn't just hold it open because he was polite. "He's just a bystander," Junho scoffed. "Some suit caught in the wrong place." "No," Florence corrected him, her voice gaining strength. "He's a regular. Table 6, he comes in every Thursday, orders a double espresso, and complains if the crema isn't thick enough. But look at his wrist." Taewon leaned in, narrowing his eyes. "Zoom in, Sector 4. The image blurred, then sharpened. On the wrist of the man holding the door was a heavy silver watch with a distinctive red face. "He was checking the time," Florence said, but he wasn't looking at the watch. He was holding his wrist up so the shooters could see the red dial. It was the visual marker. Taewon looked at her, then back at the screen. "You remember a watch from a customer on a busy Thursday night?" "I remember that he met with someone in the alley before my shift started. He was arguing with a man in a gray trench coat. He kept tapping that watch face." Taewon went still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "A gray trench coat?" "Yes, with a tear on the left lapel." Slowly, Taewon turned his gaze to Junho. "Pull up the personnel file for Kang, the new logistics head." Junho tapped furiously on the keyboard. A photo popped up. A man in a gray trench coat. On the left lapel, a distinct, jagged tear was visible in the high-res photo. Kang was supposed to clear the perimeter. Taewon said, his voice terrifyingly soft. He stood up, the movement fluid and predatory. He walked over to Florence, stopping inches from her. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her like a piece of luggage or a liability. He was looking at her like a weapon he had just discovered how to use. "You have a good eye, Miss Pious," he murmured. "Junho, bring the car around. We're going to pay Kang a visit." The smell of garlic and searing beef was the first thing to breach the sterile, conditioned air of the penthouse in days. It was an alien scent in a kitchen designed for aesthetics rather than use. Taewon entered the room, stopping abruptly at the island. The Michelin star private chef he kept on retainer was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Florence stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, stirring a heavy pot with a rhythm that spoke of years of practice. "I sent him away," Florence said, without turning around, sensing his presence. "He was making foam. I don't eat foam." Taewon watched her, a flicker of amusement softening the hard lines of his mouth. "He's one of the best chefs in the city." "He doesn't know how to season a stew," she countered, turning to set 2 bowls on the marble counter. "Sit." It was a command, not a question. Surprisingly, the man who commanded an army obeyed. He sat on the high stool, looking down at the simple, hearty beef stew. He took a bite, and for a moment, the mask of the untouchable Mafia boss slipped. "My mother used to make this," he said quietly. "In Seoul, before the money, before the suits." "You weren't always a king?" Florence asked, taking the seat opposite him. "I was a rat," Taewon corrected, his voice devoid of self-pity. "I grew up in the shadow of the glistening towers I now own. I learned early that if you want to eat, you have to take. If you want to survive, you have to strike first." He looked at her. "Hunger is a powerful teacher." "I know," Florence replied. She pushed her food around the bowl. "I didn't grow up in the shadows, but I grew up carrying the weight. After my parents left, it was just me and the little ones. I learned to be invisible so they could be seen. I learned to watch the room so they could sleep." "That is why you saw the gun," Taewon murmured. "You have the eyes of a survivor." "I have the eyes of a servant," she corrected, bitterness lacing her tone. "No." Taewon leaned forward, the movement bringing him into her personal space. The air between them suddenly grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on Florence's arms stand up. "You looked at me." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her temple. It was a tentative, almost reverent touch. Florence froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked up, and there it was again, the look. It was the same intensity that had passed between them in the restaurant, but the context had shifted tectonically. It was no longer a warning of death, it was an acknowledgement of life. For a long, silent minute, the war outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the kitchen, the smell of the stew, and the dangerous, magnetic pull of a man who saw her not as a waitress, but as an equal. "Eat," he whispered, breaking the spell, but not the tension. "You'll need your strength." The midnight blue silk gown felt less like clothing and more like a disguise, sliding cold and heavy against Florence's skin. It was a masterpiece of tailoring, designed to turn heads, but as she stepped out of the limousine and onto the red carpet of the Sapphire Gala, Florence felt exposed in a way the waitress uniform had never allowed. "Chin up," Taewon murmured, offering his arm. He looked devastating in a tuxedo that cost more than her childhood home. "You belong here." "I used to serve these people crab cakes," Florence whispered back, taking his arm. "I know how they look at the help, and I know how they look at their wives. I don't fit either category." "Good," he said, guiding her past the flashing cameras. "Predictability gets you killed." Inside, the ballroom was a kaleidoscope of crystal chandeliers and fake laughter. Florence fell into her old rhythm, not as a participant, but as a scanner. She watched the flow of the room, the waiters moving in clockwise patterns, the security detail hugging the walls. 2:00, she murmured, barely moving her lips as she accepted a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. The man near the orchestra. He's wearing a headset, but he's not security. His suit is too loose, hiding a vest. Taewon didn't look. He trusted her instantly. That's Hanul, a Goompa lieutenant. He's here to deliver a message. He's coming over, she warned. The man approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stopped 2 feet away, ignoring Florence entirely to lock eyes with Taewon. Director Seo, Hanul said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. A bold choice to bring a civilian into the lion's den. The chairman sends his regards. He wonders if she is worth the price of admission. The threat hung in the air, sharp and distinct. The room seemed to quiet around them, the elite sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. Taewon slowly transferred his champagne glass to his left hand. With his right, he reached out and placed his hand possessively on the small of Florence's back. It wasn't a gentle touch, it was a brand. He pulled her flush against his side, forcing Hanul to look at her. "You are mistaken," Taewon said, his voice projecting just enough to silence the nearby conversations. "Let it be known, this woman is under my personal protection. She is not a guest. She is an extension of my will. To touch her is to declare war on me, and I do not lose wars." He turned back to Hanul, whose smile had faltered. "Tell the chairman to update his ledger." Taewon guided Florence away, leaving a wake of stunned silence. As they moved deeper into the crowd, Florence let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a captor. She saw a fortress. The crash didn't sound like metal hitting metal. It sounded like the world snapping in half. One moment, Taewon was watching the rain streak against the bulletproof glass of the SUV, his hand resting near Florence's on the leather seat. The next, a heavy sanitation truck barreled out of a side street, T-boning the lead escort vehicle and spinning their own car into a sickening 360-degree skid. "Heads down," Taewon roared, throwing his arm across Florence's chest as the airbags deployed with a dusty punch. The world turned into a blur of smoke and shattered glass. Tear gas canisters hissed through the broken windows, filling the cabin with blinding white fog. Taewon kicked his door open, dragging Florence out onto the wet asphalt. "Stay behind me," he coughed, raising his weapon. He dropped the first shadow that emerged from the smoke, then the second. But the attack was too coordinated, too swarming. It was a suicide run. The rival clan was throwing bodies at him just to keep him pinned. "Taewon!" The scream tore through the gunfire. He spun around, blindingly fast, but the distraction had worked. 3 men in tactical gear were dragging Florence toward a waiting van. She was fighting, kicking, biting, but a rifle butt to her temple silenced her struggle. "No!" The word ripped out of his throat, raw and animalistic. He broke cover, sprinting into the open fire, shooting with terrifying accuracy. One kidnapper fell, then another, but the van doors slammed shut and tires squealed as the vehicle vanished into the labyrinth of the city. Taewon stood alone in the rain, his chest heaving, the gun shaking in his grip, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it felt like poison. Junho stumbled out of the wreckage of the lead car, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Boss, we need to regroup. We need to plan." Taewon turned. The calm, focused man who had sat in the restaurant booth was gone. In his place was a monster. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown, void of any calculation or restraint. He looked at the retreating taillights of the van, then slammed his fist into the hood of the ruined SUV, denting the reinforced steel. "No more planning," Taewon snarled, the sound low and vibrating with violence. "They wanted a reaction, they have it." He looked at Junho, his face a mask of absolute cruelty. "Mobilize everyone, the docks, the warehouses, the street crews. I don't care about the territory anymore. I don't care about the police." He reloaded his weapon, the click echoing like a gavel drop. Burn it all down, leave no one standing until I have her back. The war had begun, and for the first time, the city would see what the devil looked like when he lost his angel. The warehouse smelled of rust and impending death. Florence's wrists were raw, bleeding where the zip ties bit into her skin, but she hadn't stopped working the plastic against the jagged edge of the metal chair leg for an hour. Snap. The tie gave way. Florence didn't gasp, she held her breath. The 3 guards stationed by the door were distracted, shouting into their radios about a perimeter breach. The war, Taewon had promised, had arrived at their doorstep. Florence scanned the room. The scanner in her never turned off. Near the loading dock, a stack of oil drums stood next to a sparking fuse box. She grabbed a heavy wrench left on a crate, crept forward in the shadows, and swung it with all her might against the fuse box. Sparks showered down onto the oily rags below. The fire whooshed up instantly, angry and bright. "Fire! Secure the girl!" one guard screamed, turning around. But the girl was gone, and the wall behind them was dissolving. An explosion rocked the building, blowing the steel doors off their hinges. Through the smoke stepped Taewon. He wasn't moving with the stealth of a spy. He was moving with the inevitability of a natural disaster. He raised his weapon, dropping 2 guards before they could lift their rifles. The 3rd guard lunged for Florence. She didn't shrink back. She swung the wrench, cracking it against his knee. He howled, stumbling just enough for Taewon to put a bullet in his chest. Taewon reached her, his eyes wild, checking her for wounds. "Florence? She behind you!" she screamed. He spun, shielding her, as more men poured from the catwalks. They moved as a single unit, him firing, her calling out targets. Left! High ground! She was no longer the waitress watching the chaos. She was the navigator guiding the storm. Finally, the smoke cleared, leaving only one man standing, Chairman Jang. The rival boss stood near the office exit, clutching a briefcase, his face pale as he looked at the ruin of his stronghold. "It's over, Jang," Taewon said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a return to the cold authority of the man in the booth. "You'll bring the whole city down for a waitress?" Jang spat, raising his pistol. Taewon didn't hesitate. He fired once. The shot echoed through the cavernous space, clean and final. Jang collapsed, the threat extinguished. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and ringing. Taewon stood over the body, his chest heaving. Slowly, he turned to look at Florence. His gun was still in his hand. He looked at her with a desperate, guarded intensity, waiting for the horror, the revulsion, the judgment. He waited for her to call him a monster. Florence looked at the body, then up at Taewon. She stepped over the debris, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her bloodied hand taking his, covering the hand that held the gun. She didn't flinch. "Let's go home," she said. Taewon exhaled, a shudder running through him, and nodded. The monster had been seen, and he had been chosen anyway. 6 months had passed since the night the city burned, and the smoke had long since cleared to reveal a new skyline, one carved in Taewon's image. Florence sat in the corner booth of the Obsidian, the city's newest and most exclusive dining room. The lighting was the same warm amber she remembered from her days at the Gilded Cage, but everything else had changed. She wore a suit of cream silk, sharp and tailored, a stark contrast to the black uniform that had once defined her existence. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, no longer pulled back in the severe bun of a woman trying to be invisible. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the center of gravity. She watched the dining room with the practiced eye of a veteran. She saw the nervous flutter of the hostess's hands, the beads of sweat on the sommelier's brow, the precise, frantic choreography of the busboys. She knew the invisible currents of panic and service that flowed beneath the clinking crystal. The hush started at the entrance and rippled through the room like a wave. Sao Taewon walked in. He moved with the same predatory grace as before, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. He wasn't hunting anymore, he was surveying his kingdom. The maitre d' bowed low, a gesture of genuine reverence, not just protocol. Taewon nodded once, bypassing the other tables to slide into the booth opposite Florence. "Apologies," he said, his voice a low rumble that still made her pulse skip. The merger with the Southern Territory took longer than expected. "Did they agree?" Florence asked, reaching for her wineglass. "They had no choice," Taewon replied, simply. He looked at her, his dark eyes softening. "You look stunning." "I look expensive," she corrected with a small smile. A shadow fell over the table. A young waiter, no older than 19, stood there. His hands were shaking so badly the water pitcher in his grip rattled against the glass. He was terrified, not just of the Mafia boss, but of the woman who sat beside him, the one the rumors called the Silent Queen. "Water, ma'am, sir?" the boy stammered, barely daring to make eye contact. Florence looked at him. She looked at the frayed cuff of his white shirt, the way he leaned forward slightly to hide his trembling, the desperate need to get this right so he could keep his job. She saw herself 6 months ago, leaning over a table just like this one, terrified and brave. "Take a breath," Florence said softly. The boy froze, looking up at her. "You're doing fine," she promised, offering him a genuine, reassuring smile. "Just pour." The boy exhaled, the tension draining from his frame. He poured the water without spilling a drop, nodded gratefully, and retreated. Florence watched him go, then turned back to Taewon. He was watching her with a mixture of pride and adoration. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. The heavy gold ring on his finger was cold, but his skin was warm. She had crossed the invisible line between the servant and the served, between the powerless and the powerful. She had walked through fire to get to this booth. "Ready to order?" Taewon asked. Florence squeezed his hand, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I think I'll have everything."